the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that been blowing in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold. There the throne of God stands in the fairest of lands, and nothing shall ever grow old. All right, so chapter 37 of the book of Exodus begins by saying, now Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood. Its length was 2.5 cubits, its width 1.5 cubits, its height 1.5 cubits. And he overlaid it with pure gold inside and out, and made a gold molding for it all around. And he cast 4 rings of gold for it on its 4 feet, even 2 rings on one side of it and 2 rings on the other side of it. And he made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold. And he put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark to carry it. And he made a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide. And he made 2 cherubim of gold, and he made them of hammered work. And at the two ends of the mercy seat, 1 cherub at the one end, 1 cherub at the other end. He made the cherubim of one piece, with the mercy seat at the 2 ends. And the cherubim had their wings spread upward, covering the mercy seat with their wings, with their faces toward each other. The faces of the cherubim were toward the mercy seat. Now, we're not going to take the time to do it in class, but I'll encourage you, go back and read Exodus chapter 25, around verses 10 through 20. Which is when you get the description of what God wanted as it was given to Moses. And what you will find is that this ark was produced according to the instructions they received. It had all the characteristics that it was supposed to have. It was made in the fashion that it was supposed to be made. It was made out of the items, of the product, the material in which it was supposed to be made. So we've got acacia wood being used. We have it overlaid with pure gold. I want to talk about pure gold for just a moment. What is pure gold? Okay, so we've got a couple options. I got to repeat these for the benefit of people that are watching online. 100% purity, someone said. Unalloyed. Okay, no additives. Processed for sure. We're not talking about the way it comes out of the ground. We're talking about that which is processed and refined, correct. So the impurities are taken out. Here's why I want to talk about this. There's a couple of reasons for that. Because does anybody wear gold jewelry? Most everybody in the room that's married at least ought to at least have one thing on their hand that's made out of gold. What purity level do we measure gold in today? Carats. And what is pure gold by definition today? 24 karat. Anybody have jewelry on your body that's made out of 24 karat gold? It is way too soft. And that is actually a argument that people have made about the impracticality of these things as they're described here. It's completely impractical that this thing is overlaid in pure gold. It wouldn't work. What was that? Well, yes, but things like the rings and the pieces of things that are going to be described in a little while, things that are used. What happens to pure gold when it's used? It wears away and it bends. In fact, I've got a 10 karat gold ring on my finger, and it's 10 karat specifically because I wanted it to be able to hold up to wear. I still have issues with it bending. Got another ring at home that may be 14 karat, but I think it's 10 karat as well, that I've quit wearing altogether because the inside of it where it hits things constantly bends. And I want to talk about the fact that the word here, pure, just simply means unadulterated or refined or without impurities. There were limits to what they were actually able to do during the Bronze Age. This stuff happened during the Bronze Age. We probably are not dealing with 24 karat gold. We're probably dealing with gold much like is found in ancient Egypt stuff. Because guess who refined the gold that they're using? The Egyptians. And interestingly enough, they did have a process. There is a lot of data that's out there about how the Egyptians processed gold and refined gold, where they got it from, and the way they treated it, the things they treated it with. And it's my understanding, and I am not an Egyptologist or a specialist in any regard regarding the way they did things, but I've read that there actually was a lot of silver in their gold. That it was not 24 karat gold the way that we would think of modern gold being pure, but that actually what's being said here is that they used the very best and purest of what was available, what they had. And that this has more of a spiritual component to it than an actual physical component to it. It's not saying that this was 100% pure gold. It's saying that this was the very best gold that could be had, the very best gold that they could refine. That's what they used. They didn't use an alloy. They didn't mix it down to make it go further so that it wouldn't use as much gold, which would in the end allow for what? Where did all this material come from? We read about that, I think, last week. From the people. The people gave of their own free will, the stuff that they had. The golden calf at the bottom of the mountain much earlier. Where did the gold for the golden calf come from? Their jewelry. They gave their earrings and their rings and their various jewelry and personal possessions for that purpose. That's the same place now. Ultimately, I agree with you, it came from the Egyptians because that's where they got it from as they were departing Egypt. But the point is, they didn't try to preserve and keep for themselves as much as possible. They used the very best of what they had, and they used it exclusively. It's not talking necessarily about our concept of pure gold. It's talking about their concept of pure gold. The most pure that was available to them, the highest quality that was available to them. it tells us a little bit. It doesn't tell us exactly how the overlaying work was done, but it does tell us a little bit about how the cherub were formed. The cherub were of hammered work, which means that they had goldsmiths who worked with this and who formed it and shaped it. And I will also notice this. It says that they were made of one piece. This was no small task. It was a large piece, and it was hammered work, and there's a lot of gold here and a lot of work and a lot of craftsmanship that went into it. Does it go into a lot of detail in these 9 verses about specifically what the ark ended up looking like? No. It tells us what it was made out of. It tells us how it was made. Really doesn't tell us a whole lot about what the end product appeared. I think there's something that might be worthwhile for our consideration in that as well. God wasn't grading them on just exactly how good their hammered work was. God was grading them on what? Whether or not they followed his instructions. Whether or not they built it the way he told them to build it. So we have this pattern that's given to them back in Exodus 25. And now here in Exodus 37, they're carrying out those instructions, being very careful to do it the way that God instructed it to be done, to use the things that God instructed them to use, the type of wood, the poles and the rings. Why are they mentioned here? And why are they so important? Because that was how to carry it. He was very specific about that. And he's going to get even more specific. It says ultimately, only certain people can carry it. And this is the only way that they can carry it. And this is how you need to treat it while you're carrying it. But without these rings and these poles, they can't do any of that. And the rings and the poles aren't functional to the ark itself at all. The rings and the poles are only functional to what? To using it and carrying it and following his later instructions about not touching it and things like that. So the transport of it is even paid attention to. Now, there are events in the Bible later on where it's not always transported the way that it ought to be transported. And that leads to a really interesting event. I find it fascinating to me because it's being transported instead of with the poles and the covers that it's supposed to have while it's being transported, it's being carried on the back of a cart, which seems like a much more efficient way of transporting it. Obviously, it'd be easier to carry a big crate from my house here in the back of my car than it would be for me to pick it up and carry it by hand. Do what? It was a new car. They even built the car specifically for the purpose. And then you've got this character who's watching it. And something terrible is about to take place. Now, this is a very precious box, right? And they've carried it around with them all through the wilderness years, and then they've carried it into the promised land, and they've carried it into battle, and they've carried it, and it's kept in the in the temple, and they've kept it for years and years and years at this point. And this guy watches it being carried, and it's on this cart, and it's about to fall off the cart. And what does he do? He just stabilizes it so that doesn't happen. And what happens to him? He dies. Why? Well, because only certain people were supposed to mess with it. And that's one of the things you weren't supposed to do. And so transport was important. And it mattered. Something that generally a lot of people today would say, that's not an important detail. The transport of it, what difference does it make? And if we can find a safer way to transport it, certainly God's going to approve of that. Well, did he? No. Did he mean what he said when he asked for what he asked for? That's the question, and the answer is yes. He knew what he was asking for. He knew that it may not have been the most work efficient. That's the way I'll say it, that it wasn't the most work efficient way for it to be handled, but it was still the way he wanted it handled. And regardless of whether or not it was more work for me to handle it that way or not, or more trouble, I mean, think about this. You need to move the ark. Well, I'll tell you a quick story. My economics professor told me this story. He got a job when he was fresh out of school. He worked on a construction crew. I won't go into all the story about how he got the job. It's a fascinating story. But he was working on a construction crew, and he was working in the demolitions part of this thing. And there was a scrap piece of 2x4 on the ground, which he picked up and tossed into the waste bin. And the union steward bailed out of the union shack and came running down there and chewed him out because he was not a carpenter. He was not allowed to touch wood. So he made him get it back out of the trash can, put it back on the ground where it was, and go get a carpenter to move the wood. Problem was, the closest carpenter was a couple of miles down the construction site. So he had to go find a teamster to requisition a truck to bring him down there to get the carpenter, bring the carpenter back, to throw the piece of wood away, bring the carpenter back, then bring the truck back, and then go back to work. Of course, he was talking about how inefficient that was. It seemed foolish. There are reasons, by the way, that they have some of those rules. Whether I agree with them or not doesn't matter. There are reasons they have those rules. Same thing here. There is a reason God had it handled the way that he had it handled. Do we have to understand all the ins and outs of that reason in order to know it's the right thing to do? No. Naaman made it very clear that it didn't make any sense to him. And there's a whole slew of things other than baptism we talk about. We're instructed to sing. And we're not instructed to play instruments. And people will say, well, that's just an incidental thing. It doesn't really matter. Well, if you want to be careful and obey what is asked for and not add, then it does make a difference. And that's the point that I'm making here. The transport of it did matter. The way it was handled mattered. And the way they built it reflected that they understood that it mattered how it was transported, because they followed the instructions regarding the building so that it could be transported properly. The rings didn't make it a better ark. The poles didn't make it a better ark. By the way, what does the ark, or the word ark mean? It means vessel. They didn't help it hold more stuff or hold the stuff better, or even for that matter, look better holding it. They simply facilitated the commandment about how to transport it. And how to transport it mattered. And at this particular stage, they are paying attention to all of these details. The mercy seats made of pure gold with cherubim stretching their wings over it and facing inward and doing exactly the way God said he wanted it done. Did he specify exactly what the cherub were supposed to look like? How many feathers were to be on the wings? Not at least from what we're told. But the nature of the wings and the direction that they point and where they touch one another and how they're situated on the ark itself. By the way, the mercy seat made up the lid of this box. All of that mattered, and they did carefully. It was crafted in obedience. They didn't say, hey, you know what? I think it'll look better if we encrust this with jewels. By the way, to the human eye, it might have looked better. Or, this is really good, all this pure gold stuff, but if we use some accent metals, it'll really set the gold off and make it even more attractive. That's not what they're doing here. They're simply doing what they're asked to do. And that is the kind of service that God expects of his children. The table and its utensils are covered starting in verse 10 and reading through verse 16. Constructed of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. Sound familiar? A molding and rings added according to specifications. Sound familiar? By the way, the table was to be carried the same way the ark was to be carried, by poles. Poles, dishes, pans, jars, bowls, all made of pure gold. This is not practical. Guess what? It wasn't being made to be practical. Why was it being made? To honor God. How were they honoring God? By obeying him. By building what he told them to build. And by not second guessing him. Or thinking that their own reasoning and rationale rivaled the reasoning and rationale of God. Instead of making these plates out of pure gold, why not make them out of something else and just overlay them with gold? After all, he let us build the box of acacia wood and just overlay it with gold. Why not just overlay the plates with gold? Why not just overlay bronze utensils or silver utensils with gold instead of making them out of pure gold? Because that's not what he asked for. And so we see the same thing here. Obedience is shown in precise workmanship, matching God's prior instructions. Sacred items required not just any material, but specified materials. Does that affect us today? Okay. Unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. Now, we have to do some inferencing to get the unleavened bread part. I'm convinced that's what he used. I'm convinced that it was unleavened fruit of the vine as well, because leaven was to be removed from the house. As a result of that, I want to be careful and use those elements. But there's more to it even than that. Because what else does he tell us with regard to those elements? When he instituted the supper, he said, "Take, eat, this is my body." What does he want us to do? Do this in remembrance of me. It's not just that we use unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. It's that we use unleavened bread and fruit of the vine to do what? To remember his body and his blood, and to proclaim his death. And if our heart is not where it needs to be, then we're only offering half of the instruction instead of the whole thing. If we back up a little bit, well, we can use the table and the utensils. Who served at the table and used these utensils? The priests. And by the way, not just every priest. There was a rotation that was built into it, and certain priests that did these certain tasks. But it mattered who was in there doing it and what they were doing. And later on, when some of the priests, the sons of the high priest, to be specific in the example that I'm thinking of, were doing these things and even using the pots and the forks that they were supposed to be using, the way in which they were using them was not proper. Did it matter what they believed and their attitudes and motivations and the way in which they carried out this work? Absolutely. So not only does it matter that they're building these things according to the pattern, but also that they use them according to the instructions that were given. And so as we think about this, our prayers, which are actually in the New Testament equated to what? The smoke of the incense. And the offering of our lips, which, by the way, just so everybody knows, my take on that particular verse, the offering of our lips would include our speech, would include our singing, would include our prayers, all of the ways in which we communicate. But when it comes to our prayers are the aroma, the smoke of the incense which rises toward God. Does our attitude and frame of mind and the spirit in which our prayers are offered, does that impact whether or not we're actually praying the way that God intends to be prayed? Do we have to pay attention to the details, like the fact that he says do it without ceasing? Do we have to pay attention to the details that he says to do it from our heart? Do we have to pay attention that he says that we should open up our heart and not withhold anything from him when we pray? But that we would lay all of our concerns before God. And then ask yourself, am I doing it that way? Am I willing to actually be very raw and exposed with it? By the way, every example of godly people in the Bible that I read, their prayers are extremely raw and exposed. They express how they actually feel. They express their doubts, they express their anger, they express their questions. They don't hold anything back. There's that aspect of our prayers. We don't build things out of acacia wood and gold. We build things out of our hearts and our minds. We offer up spiritual sacrifices and spiritual worship. And so we have to think about how this teaching affects our adjudication of what I'm doing. By the way, that's where I would very much strongly encourage you to begin with, is what we each as individuals are doing ourselves before we worry about what other people are doing regarding these things. Function and sanctity are joined by faithful adherence to what is commanded. We're seeing that played out before us. The next section, verses 17 through 24. The lampstand made of hammered work from one piece of gold. It's very specific. Can you fuse pieces together? Yeah, can you fuse pieces together and make it almost imperceptible that it was made from two pieces? Yeah, it is possible. People know what they're doing that are good at it. They can do it. When they're done, you can't even tell. What would they have done? Following God's commandments, he says, make the lampstand, make it of hammered work, make it out of one piece, if the piece broke in the process of hammering it out. You start over, because it's no longer one piece. Made of hammered work from one piece of gold. The cups are shaped like almond blossoms with knobs and flowers. Why almond blossoms? I can't answer that. Accessories, the lamps, the snuffers, the trays, made of a talent of gold. A talent is a weight. So he told them specifically how much weight of gold to use to make these items. Is 90% of that weight close enough? Is 110% of that weight close enough? Well, they did it as they were asked to do it. What God commands has to be carried out with precision. Hammered work, one piece, a talent. Beauty and symbolism don't override the need for exact execution. By the way, I'll also point out this. When God says, make it like this, I want these things to be shaped like almond blossoms. Listen, it's a whole lot easier just to make a round cup than it is to hammer out an almond blossom. On a single piece, but this also introduces the next thing that some of us would do well to appreciate. God is not afraid of beauty. It's okay to do things right. The workers respected the pattern that was given them, as was brought up earlier. They didn't invent it. They didn't modify it. They accepted it as it was given. That is the same way we need to approach worship to God today. Not invent our own, not modify what God's given us, but seek to do it exactly as he's asked. Well, what if he hasn't specified? For instance, we are told to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week, right? We are told to use bread and the fruit of the vine. We are told to remember his body and his blood, proclaim his death in what we're doing. We're told to examine ourselves as we do this. Are we told whether we pass plates around, whether we sit around a table and hand it out to each person, whether or not we use little pre-measured cups? I recently read something, that's why that came to mind, that someone wrote. And to be fair to them, I have to tell you up front, they said, hey, I'm not saying that it's wrong if you're using those pre-measured cups, but this person was like, boy, I sure am glad the congregation that I'm a part of is passing it like we always have. It just is more meaningful. Not when it comes to the worship of God. Because if it mattered how we distributed it, then he would do what? He would give precise instructions about how to distribute it. Whether we came forward to the table where it was at, which is the way they do it in some traditions, or whether it's passed out, whether people sit, or whether it's picked up on the way in, there's absolutely nothing regarding that. Regardless of how it's distributed, what needs to happen? It needs to be bread. It needs to be fruit of the vine. It needs to be the body and blood to those that partake of it. We need to remember him and proclaim his death and examine ourselves and pay attention to all of those details. And by the way, I would suggest this. If I am examining myself when I partake of the bread, what am I not doing? Worrying about anybody else in the room. The only person I'm consumed with is whom? Me. Where am I at in relation to Christ? What am I doing here? Am I proclaiming his death? Am I considering and remembering his sacrifice? It's about me, and it's about Christ, and it's about honoring God, not about watching what somebody else does. You know, old brother Billy over there, he just gets a little bitty pinch. I think you got to eat more than that. But Sister Sally, boy, she breaks off a big old hunk like she's taking the whole cracker. I grew up in East Texas. That's actually how they talked. I finally got an amen. When I'm doing that, I'm not examining myself. And by the way, when it talks about worthily, that's an adverb of manner. That's not a way in which in other words, it's the manner with which I approach it that's under consideration. This is teaching me to be as concerned about the worship that I offer as they were about the things that they were doing, to be as careful about the worship that I offer as they were about the things that they were doing, to be as attentive to what God has asked for as they were to what God was instructing them. The altar of incense is covered in 25 through 28. Guess what I'm gonna say? It was made of acacia wood. It was overlaid with gold. There was a molding of horns that set at the corners. Rings and poles were made to transport it, exactly the way that God commanded. The anointing oil and the incense are prepared. Verse 29. They are prepared according to the perfumer's skill. That's what he said. That's what he wanted done. These items are made just as had been earlier commanded. They used the things and the process which he commanded them. Specific individuals with appropriate skill were entrusted to this work. They took care of it through faithful obedience. And the faithful obedience involves the right people doing the right things with the right things. So this is a chapter of execution, is what this is. This is a chapter of carrying out instructions, where God's detailed instructions are obeyed. Not just obeyed, but what? Carefully obeyed. Can I use the word meticulously obeyed? No part is invented. No part is altered. No part is personalized. But I add that to all my work. I can hear one of the artisans now. Yeah, I just always put a little bluebird in the corner. That's my signature. You know what? This work wasn't theirs. It was God's. They didn't put their stamp on it. They didn't put their signature on it. They crafted it in reverence, exactness, and faithfulness to what God commanded them to do. And this shows us that sacred work requires submission to God's word. Period. Full stop. That sacred work requires respect for his holiness. Period. Full stop. That sacred work requires the skilled use of what he provides. Period. Full stop. So when he instructs all of us to sing from our heart, what should we do? Sing like we're in the shower or in the car by ourselves. Give it everything that we have from our hearts, in sincerity, with our voices, exactly the voice that he gave us, in a way that brings glory and honor to him, not ourselves. It's okay, I'm done. Anybody have any questions or comments before we wrap up? All right, if the Lord wills, we'll be in chapter 38 next time.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever